Hi, my name is Jared Jones, and I am a mental health counselor with Care to Change Counseling here to talk about depression, and especially depression as it relates to this time being in COVID and kind of the after effects of the COVID quarantine. Now, before we get started today, I just want to mention that as we're talking about depression, I know a lot of you probably understand or have resources to know what depression is, so I'm going to go pretty quickly through just a general review of depression, but I really want to dive into some of the content specifying how we can identify and how we can just normalize depression during this time so that we can all be on the same page about our experiences, especially now that we're moving into a time where things are kind of normal, but also not normal. So depression in itself, I know we tend to use it interchangeably with like major depressive disorder or major depressive episode, but when we talk about depression, depression in itself is just a normal emotion, like any other emotion that we experience, where it kind of is like sadness, but it's in a way where that sadness is extra charged. There's more energy taken from us. There's a lower amount of like motivation and of push that we have in our life to continue to do things because of our extreme sadness. And to normalize that further, depression is something that all of us are going to experience at some point in our life. In fact, the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-5 even indicates that you can't even get a major depressive diagnosis unless it's been, more than 6 months past a major event, such as the death of a loved one, because depression is so prevalent and it's something that's really common with normal things that happen in our lives. So by saying that, I just want to say that when we talk about depression being a problem, really we're referring to that emotion of depression that's happening for too long and is causing dysfunction in our lives that is really leaving an impact and making it difficult for us to carry on our day-to-day lives. Excuse me. So another thing I want to point out before we get into this is that there's different versions of depression. There's different ways that depression can look. So when we talk about depression, there are people who experience depression as a major mental health issue, something that's been pre-existing. Maybe they've been fighting it for their whole life. Maybe they've been managing it really well, but still struggle with it some days. And there are some people who refer to depression as something that you experience. Maybe there's a major change in your life and you're feeling depressed for a long time, or there's other ways that depression can pop up normally in our lives. So I just wanted to point that out to say we're going to be talking about a broad spectrum here, and I'm going to try and be as detailed and informative as possible with which depression I'm referring to. But across the board, with us going through this quarantine and coming out of COVID, many of us can be feeling all these different versions of depression, and maybe no two people's depression is exactly alike, but we can still acknowledge that and allow ourselves to experience that, to allow that depression to be expressed emotionally so that we can continue to move forward and acknowledge it and learn what we need to do to get through this difficult time. So I want to make a distinction between what I'm referring to, and these aren't necessarily scientific terms, but between normative depression and clinical depression. I'm going to go into more detail on each of these, but just to start putting it out there first, depression has a very wide range that it can be experienced. Some people have, like I said, that short episode after a major change. Some people's depression is based off of another emotion that they're experiencing. We'll talk a little bit more about the connection between anxiety and depression later. However, some other people put up with a lot more than just what we would call like a normative depression. They have depression that comes from a lot greater cause and is usually more pervasive, meaning that it lasts longer and it's more enduring. And those individuals, they call it clinical depression because they tend to need clinical intervention to work through and to fight that depression, to get through to the other side. So with this COVID quarantine that had happened, a lot of what was going on during that time triggers the whole spectrum of depression that we experience. So if you think about it, like one of the major hallmarks of the quarantine was being stuck at home, not being able to go out to do our normal activities that we typically do in our life. And because of that, that's a big factor that plays into depression. In fact, most people who experience depression, whether it be clinical or normative, tend to have a reduction in those activities that they usually spend their days doing. Whether that be going to work or going to sports, spending time with their kids, spending time with their friends, getting out and doing anything that wasn't just, socially distanced walks in the park. A lot of our self-care routines tended to suffer through COVID as well. Having more days where you had more free time, or we're stuck at home and didn't have all of the normal activities that we had to do. So we didn't really have those things to fill our day with. And because of that, we tended to slack off a little bit. Maybe we spent too much time watching movies or TV shows on streaming platforms, or maybe we spent too much time just laying around, maybe sleeping, maybe trying to find something to do, trying to pick up other activities around the home, and maybe struggled with that. For some of us, that meant more responsibilities, more things to do around the house. Some people took on extra projects, like around the house projects, repainting a room, buying new furniture, doing things around that. Other people had to become their kids' teachers. They had to learn how to work with their kids through their time, doing e-learning and online classes, while also trying to, parent that whole time. And that's really hard job, because not only do you have to be a parent, but you have to be, a teacher, a tutor to your kids. You have to help them in a home where normally your kids maybe were going to different schools or were with their friends all day. Now they're stressed out and they have to do homework and, let's be honest, put up with some of their siblings, for those who have siblings. And it puts a lot of stress on the home. So that's just that different environment that adds more to that pressure. And all of these things hurt those self-care and those care strategies that people who experience depression would normally be able to use to get out of that. Even people who have like a normal experience of depression, or people who would normally never experience depression in their life, might get that feeling now, because that's what COVID has kind of created an environment for, especially those who are susceptible. So I'm going to dive a little bit more deeply into kind of these two levels of depression that I'm talking about. And I want to be very clear that this isn't like a scientific dive into this. I just want to compare these two, because maybe you fall into one of these categories, maybe you fall into like a third category, or kind of in between these two. But I just want to really normalize our experience to say many of us are feeling a lot of the same thing, while still respecting that our struggles may be different and we may not have the exact same experiences, but we can acknowledge this in each other to help support each other as much as we can. So first, I'll mention clinical depression. Again, like I said earlier, this is typically depression, this mood that's so intense. Usually we need some kind of intervention, whether that be, medication for it. Some people go to therapy. There are some depressions that require surgery intervention or other medical interventions. Some people need like really intensive treatment. And they often, with clinical depression, it often has a bigger cause underlying it. So, some people may have a biological problem. Maybe their brain chemistry doesn't work the same as other people. Maybe they've had major injuries in their life that are causing that depression. Maybe they're recovering from other problems that are leading to that depression. Sometimes a history of trauma, or like child abuse, can cause trauma. Any other major history events, unprocessed grief, or unfinished grief from the past. Maybe someone has lost a major thing in their past and they've never really come over that, and they're still experiencing that depression for the rest of their life. Any of these causes could be what would cause clinical depression. However, clinical depression doesn't tend to be a one-to-one thing. There's never like a clear-cut cause as to why this thing's going on, or even just like an answer. Usually there's a lot more complex things going on that even if you can identify a root cause to it, and have some kind of treatment to it, a lot of people still don't have like a full recovery from it, and they still have to manage it the rest of their life. Some people will go years and years still trying to fight their depression with on again, off again depressive episodes. You may know someone who's like this, who has been diagnosed with major depression or some kind of clinical depression in the past, and maybe they've recovered and they've been functional for a very long time, which is wonderful. But sometimes they'll slip back into those episodes. Sometimes that depression may recur, and even with the right medication, even with the right therapy, sometimes that depression just comes back, and maybe it's not as bad as it was originally, but you're still struggling with it. So we have to keep in mind that, for someone who has a long-term clinical depression, that may be something that some of these recent environmental conditions with the quarantine could really trigger, like almost a recurrence or relapse into that. And they may be struggling harder with this, not because they're not doing the right therapy techniques, or they're not taking the right medication, they're not doing the right, interventions during that time. Our environment will really limit our ability to care for ourselves and to continue to cope with that. So these tend to be the people that are most susceptible during this time. And I really want to encourage us to, if you know someone has had a major depression diagnosis or has been treated for clinical depression in the past, to just keep that in mind, that this time may be really hard for them. And even if it seems like things are so simple, like maybe things seem to be going well for them, maybe they're not struggling, excuse me, with as many problems as other people did. There's a lot of outcomes that have been very negative for many families during this time of the quarantine. But even at that, a single change, not being able to do your favorite activity because that place is closed, maybe there's a certain thing you were looking forward to with this summertime schedule that is now shut down, that may be enough to trigger someone's resurgence into a depressive episode. So we need to understand that individuals who have that clinical depression are very vulnerable during this time, but maybe not. Maybe this time has given them the advantage to be more manageable of their depression. Maybe this is someone who their depression really picks up with too much stress or too much interaction with others, and they've been able to thrive during this time. But we'll never know unless we ask them about that. So now kind of switching gears, we're going to talk about more normative depression during this time of COVID and quarantine. Now, when I mean normative, just by that term, again, I'm kind of using my own word for that. I mean, this is a normal expression of depression. It's not necessarily something that, you would experience outside of a situation of this. Maybe you're a very big busybody, someone who's always involved with your activities or work or hobbies or whatever. You've never had an experience of depression in the past. But now, because you're limited from those things or because of some of the after effects of COVID, you're now experiencing some of that depression. Maybe it's harder to get up in the morning, or it's harder to stay motivated to do everything you would plan for yourself to do at home because you can't do the other things that you really want to. Maybe it's harder to feel good about yourself. Maybe your self-concept has fallen a little bit, or you're struggling because you don't get to spend the time with friends and family like you really wanted to be able to do. Maybe this is coming from another area, such as not being able to feel accomplished in your life because you're not doing as much because you're forced to stay home. There's a lot of ways that this depression can look. On top of that, like I mentioned earlier, there is a connection between anxiety and depression. In fact, anxiety disorders and depressive disorders tend to coexist quite frequently. They tend to be co-diagnosed. And it kind of makes sense, being that anxiety is sort of like that activating feeling. Anxiety is something that we feel when we have worries or intense fears about something, which during this time with the quarantine, we know that anxiety's been up. But what a lot of people experience with their anxiety is after a while of feeling anxious and being overwhelmed by their anxiety, it's almost always followed by this period of depression or this consistent depression that's happening because we tend to burn ourselves out with anxiety. Anxiety overrides our mind and the resources of our mind to where we kind of can't use that to help ourselves anymore. And our mind runs so much, you can think of it as like a car that's left unparked, but you're pushing down the gas pedal all the way. Eventually, you're just going to burn up your internal systems because the motor's running so fast, but there's no way to actually use that energy that's going on. And so we deplete ourselves and fall into what I'll call more of a normative depression, a depression that's related to a situation or an environment that we've been into. This depression can happen to anyone. It's typically a lot less pervasive. So individuals who maybe experience more of this normative depression are typically situational. They're not as long-term. And they tend to respond better to some of those simple treatments. So, when people give out that advice of, oh, well, you should just go get exercise, or, oh, you should just go eat a healthier meal, or go visit and be social with people, that tends to be the advice that you give to someone who's experiencing some of that normative depression. Now, that advice I will advocate is really bad for people who have long-term or clinical depression because those interventions don't necessarily work. But for someone who maybe has never experienced depression and doesn't have one of those causes of depression that's worthy of clinical intervention, maybe some of those interventions are going to be helpful. And that is something that you can do in your life. But I will say that normative depression, for some of those simple interventions to work, tends to be the depressions that we overlook the most. We tend to not notice that depression is going on in our life. And so I would really like to encourage everyone who, may be having symptoms of not finding enjoyment in activities as much as you used to, finding it hard to get out of bed or to get motivated to do your normal tasks and chores throughout the day. People who are having a bad self-concept, who are feeling bad about themselves, maybe you're feeling lazy, or maybe you've been neglecting some self-care during this time of quarantine, to pay attention to some of those symptoms and look up if maybe you're experiencing a mild or moderate brief episode of depression. and how you can help yourself through that. But overall, I just want to say that it's just as important. Now we're asking people who have had clinical depression in the past or are beginning to experience clinical depression about what they're feeling, as important as it is to talk to people who have that normative depression. We think about individuals with that long-term depression to be the most susceptible, which in some cases they are. But we also should be asking people who've never had that before, people who we start to see some of these signs and symptoms with, or people that maybe we don't even catch any of these symptoms, to start asking them, are you feeling depressed? Are you feeling down and like life's been kind of hard on you lately? Or is it hard to be able to just live and exist in this world? Because the earlier we catch it, the earlier we can have some of those interventions. Sometimes that clinical depression can come from many, many situations and years of that normative depression, having some of those depressive episodes that eventually built up enough to be a long clinical or clinically intervention needing experience. So I hope that this talk has been able to inform you of something, that I've been able to give you something to take away today. Thank you for listening. Hopefully, if you need help or are experiencing any of these symptoms, this will give you the encouragement to reach out. If you or someone is having struggles with this, get them connected with someone, whether that be a loved one or maybe a community leader, maybe someone they look up to in their life, maybe a religious or faith leader, or if the depression seems to be bad enough, even if it is kind of in that normative category, that it's beginning to really affect your life and it's becoming a challenge just to exist every day, contact a professional, reach out to someone, do a Google search, and try and find a professional area that you can talk to, at least to get an evaluation and see, is this something that you're really struggling with and may need some clinical intervention. For both normative and clinical, counseling is a great resource to be able to use, even if you're going to recover from it pretty quickly, even if you have the resources to be able to work through and cope through and get to the other side of your depression, it's still a good idea to check that out with someone just to make sure, and also to maybe have that experience quickened for you, to have that other person to share that with so that you can feel understood and that you can process through it faster. If you guys have any more questions or need help in any other way, feel free to reach out to us at Care to Change. You can either email help, H-E-L-P, at caretochange.org, or you can call us at 317-790-9396. I also want to remind you, we are all in this together. And I really want to encourage you to keep fighting through this time, even though we've been fighting for so long, to keep trying to live with this new normal and moving forward. Thank you.